When the bailiff called all rise, Victor Langford stayed seated and slid a folded note across the glossy defense table. A tight little square of arrogance with 5 words written in ink that had not yet dried. Everyone has a price. Judge. The rustle of the courtroom rose and fell like a single breath caught in a ribcage. Cameras muttering shutters, shoes scraping, suits straining as the whole room stood out of muscle memory and fear, all except the billionaire whose name sat on hospitals, gala banners, and the riverfront he had bought piece by piece as if the city were a chessboard that existed to be conquered. He did not look up at the black-robed figure entering behind the bench, and he did not look at the note he had placed within easy reach of the clerk. He simply tapped a fingertip against the polished wood and waited for the silence to recognize him. Judge Maya Carter could not miss him. No one could. He was a sculpted interruption in a ritual that drew its power from choreography. She reached her seat, glanced across the room, and in the gentle set of her shoulders the veterans recognized a decision. She would not perform outrage for the cameras. She would not give him the heat he craved. The oath rose and fell. The court took its seat. And still Victor did not move, content to rest in a slouch that seemed designed by a stylist to say, "I cannot be compelled." Maya's gavel touched once, not a strike but a soft reminder that the room belonged to law before ego, and her voice, steady and clear, filled the chamber with a cadence that had carried juries through nightmares and led them back to daylight. Proceedings began as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet everything had shifted because a line had been drawn that could no longer be ignored. The government's lead attorney, a careful man who disguised sharpness inside politeness, rose to review exhibits, while the defense team adjusted cufflinks and whispered into Victor's ear, with the panicked energy of pilots who had just lost altitude and were pretending it was part of the flight plan. Reporters angled for reflections on the bench's varnish, hunting for the judge's eyes because eyes tell the story you cannot write on a docket sheet. Victor uncapped a pen with a click meant to be heard and signed something with excessive strokes, his jaw flexing as if every letter were a rebuke to gravity. The note he had placed was taken by the clerk as evidence for the record, catalogued without ceremony, and the slight tilt of Victor's head suggested he believed that even chain of custody could be bent by money that traveled in whispers. Maya called the first witness, and as the witness walked, Victor spoke at a volume calculated to skate just under contempt, a murmur in which entitlement tried to pass for confidence, saying to his attorney that he would not stand for a spectacle, as if the court itself were a show built around his refusal, as if the law were a stage he had financed. The jury watched the judge watch the defendant, and that invisible triangle of attention began to shape a story no press release could edit. The witness, a former city inspector with the tired posture of a man who had learned the price of courage, took the oath with hands that trembled, and Victor, never missing a chance to occupy air, smirked. Maya asked precise questions, not to perform intelligence but to reveal it, and the inspector's answers formed a lattice of dates, signatures, offshore entities, and cash disguised as consulting fees that flowed like a river engineered to flood the same neighborhoods that could never get a permit approved without a handshake and a promise. The courtroom leaned in because survival is a language older than law, and betrayal has a sound all its own when it is finally named. When the government introduced photographs of a condemned building rehabilitated only on paper, Victor allowed himself a small laugh that did not reach his eyes, and a woman in the gallery, gray-haired and dignified in a church hat, whose ribbon trembled with the force of her breathing, closed her fingers around a prayer card until it bent. The image of a saint creased along the face. She had lost her husband when the ceiling gave way, a story the city had learned and then conveniently unlearned, and now the man she blamed for the shortcuts that killed good people refused to grant a standing acknowledgement of the court that promised her something like repair. Maya saw the prayer card in the hands that held it. She saw the jurors' faces harden, and she saw her own reflection in the brass rail, a reminder that impartiality did not mean emotionless. It meant fairness even when fairness costs more than rage. She turned a page on the bench with measured calm, then fixed her gaze on Victor with the kind of patience that outlasts storms. "Mr. Langford," she said at an appropriate pause, her voice even, "you will refrain from commentary while counsel examines the witness." No thunder, no threat, just a boundary drawn as neatly as a signature on a birth certificate. And for the first time a flick of uncertainty crossed Victor's face like a cloud across glass. He met her eyes and held them too long, trying to turn a stare into a win. And in that held look, the gallery felt the chill of what was truly on trial. The idea that power could purchase respect rather than earn it. Outside, a siren stitched the city to the courthouse. Inside, a page turned again, the next exhibit marked, the witness steadied by the certainty in the judge's tone. Victory, Victor had always believed, belonged to the loudest man in the room, but the room belonged to her, and the note with its 5 words lay sealed now, not as a secret, but as a fuse, the fall of power. The trial dragged into its second week like a wound that refused to heal. Every morning, Victor Langford arrived in a tailored navy suit, escorted by his legal entourage and flanked by bodyguards, who pretended not to notice the protesters holding signs that said "Justice for the Forgotten." Cameras followed his every step, feeding headlines that painted him as a misunderstood genius or an untouchable tyrant, depending on the network. Inside the courtroom, however, power had begun to shift in ways no lens could capture. Judge Maya Carter didn't need to raise her voice or bang the gavel. She simply waited, spoke softly, and let silence work like gravity. The louder Victor became, the smaller he looked. On the third morning, the clerk announced that the court had received new financial records from a whistleblower. The defense objected immediately, claiming the evidence was manufactured. Victor smirked as if the whole system were just a theater he could close at intermission. But the clerk's voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what was inside the sealed folder. Maya's eyes flickered to the label. Langford Industries 2008, Internal Transactions. Something in her chest tightened. That year, she remembered, had marked the collapse of dozens of low-income housing projects across the state, one of which had killed her husband. She kept her face neutral. Judges were trained to silence emotion, to bury it beneath procedure and precedent, but the ghosts of memory have their own way of rising in daylight. She remembered the phone call from the hospital, the voice of a nurse saying there had been an accident during renovation work at a property owned by a subsidiary she had never heard of. Back then, she was just a district attorney, a widow with a newborn and a mountain of grief. And now, all these years later, that same corporation, rebranded, renamed, was back in front of her bench, linked to the man sitting so proudly before her. "Your Honor," Victor's attorney said, adjusting his tie, "we object to the admission of these documents without verification." "Objection noted," Maya replied, her tone like tempered glass. "The court will review the material before ruling on admissibility." Victor leaned back, a smile ghosting across his lips. "You can review anything you want, Judge," he said under his breath. "It won't change who's in control, but the room heard. The jury heard. The cameras heard." Maya paused, letting the air settle before she spoke again. "Mr. Langford," she said quietly, "you will address this court with respect. Power does not grant permission to forget manners." The crowd stilled. Even Victor's attorney swallowed hard, realizing the performance had crossed a line. By the afternoon session, the tension was a living thing. Witness after witness began to turn, former accountants, construction supervisors, city inspectors. Their stories echoed the same pattern, bribes hidden as consulting bonuses, properties flipped under false safety clearances, signatures forged in the night. Maya listened to each word with the composure of stone, but inside, her pulse drummed with something dangerous. Recognition. Then came a shock no one expected. The prosecution introduced a photograph recovered from the whistleblower's files, a faded image of a construction site accident from years ago. Maya's breath caught. It was that building, the one that had taken her husband's life. The same shell company, the same address, the same fraudulent safety certificate bearing Victor Langford's signature. Her fingers tightened around the gavel. She wanted to look away but couldn't. Justice and pain had just collided in the most personal way possible. The courtroom murmured. Reporters scribbled furiously. Victor shifted uncomfortably for the first time, sensing that something had changed, not in the evidence but in the atmosphere. The air itself seemed to know he was cornered. He leaned toward his lawyer. "Find out how she got that photo," he hissed, "and make it disappear." But this wasn't his boardroom. This was her courtroom. When the recess was called, Maya walked back to her chambers, her heart heavy with unspoken history. On her desk waited a file, Her clerk had slipped it in quietly, summarizing the whistleblower's testimony. The name on the top page made her freeze. Harold Mason. He had once worked as her husband's project supervisor, and underlined in the statement was a single, devastating line. Victor Langford ordered cost cuts that eliminated structural reinforcements. Despite engineers' warnings, she sank into her chair, closing her eyes. Fate had drawn a cruel circle. The man she had sworn to judge fairly was the same man indirectly responsible for the loss that had defined her entire life. But justice demanded control, not vengeance. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. The world outside believed she was unshakable. Only the quiet walls of her chambers knew how hard she fought to remain that way. As she returned to the bench, Victor smirked again, confident that money still meant immunity. But at that moment, Maya Carter no longer saw a billionaire. She saw a man standing in the shadow of his own empire, built on bones he had forgotten, and about to be undone by the truth he thought could never surface. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the discipline, beneath the robe, something began to awaken. It wasn't anger. It was for a purpose. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt not broken, but ready. Cracks behind the curtain. The third week of the trial opened under gray skies, as if the city itself had paused to watch what would unfold inside that courthouse. The morning light poured through tall windows, slicing across the oak walls and landing on Victor Langford's face like an interrogation lamp. He had begun to show small fractures. Nothing obvious, just the faint tremor in his hand when he lifted a pen, the longer blinks when the witnesses spoke, the flicker of unease when the cameras found his eyes. To the public, he still looked composed, but Maya Carter saw the truth. Years of reading faces had trained her to spot the moment when confidence turned to fear, even if it wore a $5,000 suit. New evidence arrived that morning. Emails, hundreds of them, pulled from a personal server Victor thought was destroyed. The courtroom buzzed as the prosecution announced that these records contained internal communications about construction approvals and illegal fund transfers. Victor's lead attorney, trembling but loyal, objected again, saying it was a breach of privacy. Maya overruled him, her calm authority leaving no room for debate. The first email projected onto the screen was simple but deadly. Proceed with cheaper materials. The city inspector has already handled it. The timestamp was from a month before the collapse of the building that killed Maya's husband. The jury's reaction was a collective intake of breath, the kind of silence that hums with disbelief. Maya forced her voice to remain steady as she directed the court reporter to read the next exhibit. Behind her calm exterior, her thoughts raced. Every line of those emails felt like a cut through old scars. She remembered holding her baby that night years ago, watching news footage of rescue workers carrying out covered bodies. Now she knew whose decisions had buried those lives. The truth had a weight that could either destroy or define her, and she was determined to choose the latter. When the lunch recess was called, Victor retreated to a private consultation room with his attorney. The air inside was thick with desperation. "We can't let those emails go public," the lawyer whispered. "We'll lose everything." Victor's response came cold and calculated. "We won't lose," he said. "We'll redirect." "How?" He smiled faintly, a shadow of his old arrogance. "We find her weakness. Every judge has one. I want everything about Maya Carter. Family, past rulings, finances, even her grief. Especially her grief." Hours later, a hired investigator delivered a file thicker than a Bible. Inside were photos of Maya's late husband, newspaper clippings about the collapse, and even personal details about her son now in college. Victor flipped through them like a man surveying assets, but when he reached the final page, his smirk faltered. There was a letter, handwritten, dated just before the accident, from one of his former executives warning him that cutting safety corners would lead to deaths. The signature at the bottom was familiar: Eleanor Langford, his own wife. Victor stared at the name. She had died 5 years earlier, cancer taking her quietly in their estate by the lake. He had loved her in his own detached way, more for her loyalty than her heart. But the letter was a ghost from the past he didn't expect. It proved she had known his crimes before anyone else and had tried to stop him. His hand shook. He tore the page in half, then again, but the words stayed burned into his memory. "If you continue down this road, it will destroy everything you built. And one day someone stronger than you will make you answer for it. When he returned to the courtroom that afternoon, his arrogance seemed forced, his smile brittle. Maya noticed the difference immediately. "Mr. Langford," she said as he took his seat, "I remind you again that this court demands decorum." "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, but there was a strange quiver in his tone, almost human. The next witness was Elena Langford, his daughter. Her name had been quietly added to the list that morning, requested by the prosecution after her voluntary statement. The room hushed as she entered, elegant but pale, her hands trembling. Victor looked up, disbelief flashing across his face. "Elena," he murmured, "what are you doing?" She didn't meet his eyes. "Telling the truth," she whispered. The prosecutor approached gently. "Miss Langford, in your statement you mentioned your mother kept records about your father's business. Could you explain?" Elena nodded slowly. "My mother always said that the truth was the only inheritance she wanted to leave me. Before she died, she gave me a key. Said one day it would open a safe that mattered more than money. I found it last year. Inside were documents, her journal, and a copy of that letter she sent my father." The courtroom gasped. Victor's composure shattered. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "You're confused. Grief makes you—" "Stop," Elena said, her voice breaking but strong. "I'm not confused. I'm ashamed. You taught me that wealth meant never having to say sorry. But I'm here because I refuse to inherit your silence." Maya's chest ached. The sight of a daughter confronting her father's sins tore through her like memory. She saw herself in Elena, the younger woman who once begged for truth and never received it. The court recessed after the testimony, but no one moved. The room was suspended between shock and pity, between justice and tragedy. As Victor sat alone staring at the empty witness stand, a low tremor of realization crept into his expression. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he could win. Not because of evidence, but because his empire had turned to sand beneath his feet. And high above, from her bench, Judge Maya Carter understood something deeper. This case was no longer about corruption. It was about redemption, though not everyone would survive earning it. The unmasking by the fourth week, the trial had turned into a national obsession. News anchors dissected every gesture. Social media divided itself into tribes. And the courthouse steps became a daily battlefield for protesters demanding justice, and supporters insisting Victor Langford was the victim of political persecution. But inside that high-ceilinged room, where sunlight poured through the stained glass and landed on the worn wood floors, the only sound that mattered was the steady rhythm of truth breaking through layers of lies. Victor sat motionless as the morning session began. His eyes bloodshot, his posture stiffer than ever. The once impeccable billionaire looked older, his confidence hollowed by weeks of exposure. His daughter Elena's testimony still hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear. He hadn't spoken to her since, though his lawyers urged him to stage reconciliation for public sympathy. He refused. He had built empires on control, not apologies. The prosecution called a surprise witness, a middle-aged man with haunted eyes and calloused hands. The gallery leaned forward as he introduced himself. Harold Mason, former site supervisor, Langford Development, 2008 to 2013. The name hit Maya like a lightning strike. This was the man whose name she had seen on the whistleblower's statement, the same one who had worked alongside her late husband. Her throat tightened, but she gave no outward sign. She had waited years for justice. She could wait one more hour to see what truth looked like under oath. Harold's testimony began simply. Timelines, budget approvals, structural designs. But then his voice cracked. "We told them it wasn't safe," he said, eyes glistening. "We begged for more steel reinforcement for quality cement. Victor said safety didn't sell, speed did. He told us the faster the ribbon cutting, the faster the money. He said anyone who questioned him could find another job." The silence in the courtroom was heavy enough to crush stone. The defense attorney rose instantly. "Objection, speculative, prejudicial." "Overruled," Maya said, her voice calm but laced with gravity. "The witness will continue," Harold continued, revealing the document trail that tied Victor directly to safety violations, bribes to inspectors, and falsified reports. But it was what came next that turned the courtroom into a storm. The prosecution presented a recording, an old voicemail left on Harold's company phone. A man's voice, unmistakable, smooth but cold. "Keep your mouth shut. Families grieve and move on. Don't make me remind you what happens to people who don't." The sound of Victor's voice echoed through the speakers, unmistakable in its arrogance. Reporters' pens froze. Jurors' faces hardened. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears. She saw not the billionaire before her, but the shadow of the man who had turned tragedy into profit. Victor's attorney shot to his feet again, shouting about manufactured evidence and defamation. But this time, even he didn't sound convinced. The judge ordered a brief recess. The jurors filed out, whispering to one another, their faces pale. When the doors closed, Victor exploded. "This is a setup," he barked. "They're framing me." He pointed a shaking finger at the prosecutor. "You think you can destroy me? I own this city." Maya's gavel struck once. "Enough." "You think that robe makes you powerful?" Victor sneered, leaning forward. "I made judges. I made politicians. You're just a symbol someone needed to make the news." Maya stared at him for a long moment, her voice low, controlled but vibrating with moral fire. "Symbols outlast kings, Mr. Langford." The courtroom broke for lunch, but whispers rippled across the city. That afternoon, when court resumed, Maya noticed something new. A group of federal agents sitting quietly in the back row. The Department of Justice had taken interest, and that meant the trial's reach was expanding beyond the walls of her courtroom. But the day's biggest shock came from a place no one expected. During the late session, Elena Langford returned, carrying a sealed envelope. Her lawyer requested permission to submit it into evidence on her behalf. Maya approved. When the contents were revealed, a low murmur swept through the room. Inside were bank transfer records from Victor's private Swiss account. Payments, made to anonymous recipients only days after the building collapse 15 years earlier. The total, $3 million. The recipient, Harold Mason. Gasps echoed. Harold looked shattered. "No," he said, trembling. "That wasn't me. I never took—" But Victor's attorney was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this proves—" The witness was paid off and is now lying to protect himself. The courtroom turned to chaos, voices overlapping, the air buzzing with accusation and disbelief. Maya banged her gavel, restoring order, though her own mind raced. Either the payment was blackmail money to silence Harold, or proof of a deeper conspiracy. "Mr. Mason," she said softly, "did you ever receive these funds?" Harold shook his head violently. "No, Your Honor. I swear on my life." "Then where did they go?" she asked. He looked toward Victor, whose lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Ask him," Harold whispered. But before Victor could respond, his lawyer stepped in, requesting an adjournment to clarify the source of these transactions. The judge granted a short recess. As the crowd filtered out, Elena approached Maya's bench quietly, tears streaking her face. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she said softly. "But I had to do what was right. My mother told me one lie can poison generations." Maya placed a steady hand on the bench. "Truth doesn't destroy the good, Miss Langford. It only reveals it." When Maya returned to her chambers, she found an anonymous envelope waiting on her desk. No return address, no signature, just her name written in thick black ink. Inside was a single photograph, her husband smiling on the construction site the day before he died. On the back, scrawled in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 6 chilling words. He wasn't the only one killed. The photo slipped from her hand. For the first time in years, Judge Maya Carter felt fear not for justice but for what truth was about to surface next. Judgment Day approaches. The city had turned gray again, the kind of color that settled into people's bones. Outside the courthouse, reporters huddled under umbrellas, whispering into microphones as if afraid the rain itself was listening. Inside, the air was electric, heavy with anticipation. It was the second to last day of the trial. The day everyone knew would either crown Victor Langford's arrogance or carve his downfall into the history books. Judge Maya Carter sat alone. In her chambers before the proceedings began, the photograph from the anonymous envelope resting on her desk like a haunting relic. He wasn't the only one killed. The words refused to leave her mind. For 15 years she had believed her husband's death was the single tragedy born from corporate greed. But now that sentence suggested something darker. Perhaps someone else had been silenced. Maybe someone who had come too close to the truth. She stared at the picture again, tracing her husband's smile. That morning he had called her saying he'd found something odd in the safety inspection paperwork. He promised to show her when he got home. He never made it. The collapse had killed 3 workers and her husband instantly. But what if the accident had been planned to bury evidence and him with it? The thought made her breath catch, a realization cutting through years of grief like lightning through fog. A knock on the door snapped her back. It was her clerk, pale and uneasy. "Your Honor," she whispered, "there's a man outside requesting to speak with you privately. He says it's about the photograph." Maya's instincts flared. Judges didn't take private meetings during trials, but something in the clerk's tone, that tremor of urgency, made her nod. "Bring him in." The door opened to reveal a frail older man wearing a worker's jacket still dusted with cement. He removed his cap, eyes hollow. "Judge Carter," he said quietly, "I was there that day, the collapse. I was one of the foremen." His voice cracked under the weight of guilt. "I kept quiet because I was scared. They made sure we were all scared." "Who?" Maya asked, her heart thudding. "Langford's men," he said. "Not Victor himself, but people who did his dirty work. There was another worker, Thomas Ray. He told me he was going to the city board with proof of tampered blueprints. The next day, the scaffolding went down. He died too. They said it was a freak accident. It wasn't." Maya's pulse roared in her ears. 2 deaths, not 1. A cover-up deeper than anyone had imagined. "Why come forward now?" she asked softly. "Because the same man who told me to keep quiet disappeared last week," he said. "And before he did, he told me to deliver this to you." He reached into his jacket and handed her a small flash drive. Said it'd explain everything. Before she could question further, the bailiff knocked. "Court's in session, Your Honor." She took the drive, slid it into a folder, and composed herself. Justice first, truth later. When she entered the courtroom, every seat was filled. The press waited like predators. The jury sat rigid, the air thick with the weight of finality. Victor Langford turned his head as she approached the bench. His face was pale but defiant, his jaw set in the same arrogance he'd carried from day one. But something else flickered behind his eyes now, a flicker of fear. The prosecution began their closing argument, meticulously reconstructing the pattern of deceit, forged documents, bribes, offshore transfers, and human cost. Every detail was a nail in the coffin Victor had built with his own hands. The jurors followed every word, their faces carved with disbelief. When the prosecutor displayed the voicemail recording again, the courtroom fell into a stillness so deep that even the rain outside seemed to stop. Then it was the defense's turn. Victor's lawyer rose slowly, his voice smooth but desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is not about morality. It's about perception. My client built half this city, gave thousands of people jobs, donated millions to hospitals and schools. Are we to believe that a man who has given so much could be capable of such deliberate cruelty?" He paused dramatically, gesturing toward Victor, who lifted his head just slightly, trying to recover his lost dignity. "Mistakes were made," the lawyer continued, "but mistakes are not murder. Greed is not a crime. Ambition is not guilt." The words hung in the air like smoke, persuasive, poisonous. Maya felt the pull of them, the temptation to see the world in shades of gray. But then she glanced at the gallery, at the woman, still clutching her prayer card, at Elena Langford trembling in the front row, at Harold Mason staring into his folded hands, and she remembered why the law existed. to give a voice to the silenced. When the defense rested, Victor requested permission to address the court directly. Maya hesitated but granted it. He rose slowly, gripping the stand with both hands. "You all think you know me," he began, his voice surprisingly soft. "You think I'm a monster. Maybe I am. But let me tell you something, power doesn't corrupt. Survival does. I built everything from nothing. I clawed my way through a world that never forgave weakness. So yes, I cut corners. Yes, I made enemies. But I did it for success, for legacy." He looked directly at Maya then. "And you, Judge Carter. You stand there pretending to be pure, but I know you're kind. You hide behind justice, but you bleed like the rest of us. Don't you?" The insult was meant to wound, but Maya didn't flinch. "The difference," she said quietly, "is that I learned how to bleed with honor." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor's face flushed with anger. For a moment it looked like he might lash out, but he didn't. Instead he straightened, composed himself, and whispered, "You'll regret this." The bailiff escorted the jury out for deliberation. As the heavy doors closed, Maya finally exhaled, her hand brushing against the folder with the flash drive. Inside it lay answers, maybe even redemption, but also danger. She had no idea yet that by nightfall, the truth on that drive would change everything, and somewhere in the crowd, unnoticed, a man in a dark coat slipped quietly out of the courtroom, leaving behind the faint scent of cigarette smoke and the sense that the story was far from over. The final verdict night fell over the courthouse like a curtain closing on a play that had gone on too long. The city outside buzzed with tension. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed at the clouds as if begging the heavens for one more headline. Inside, Judge Maya Carter sat alone in her chambers, the glow from her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Before her lay the flash drive, that small, unassuming object handed to her by the trembling foreman. She had waited for the jury to finish deliberation, but her instincts told her this would be the final key to everything. She plugged it in, heart pounding. The drive contained only one folder labeled Blueprints. Inside, not architectural plans, but a series of video files. She clicked the first. The screen flickered and a grainy recording came to life. It showed a younger Victor Langford standing in a warehouse office talking to two men in hard hats. His voice was unmistakable, calm, commanding, cold. "Make sure the supports are pulled before inspection," he said. "I want the city to approve before the structure's redone." One of the men hesitated. "That's unsafe, Mr. Langford." Victor leaned closer to the camera, unaware it was recording. "You're paid to do, not to think." The second video was worse. It showed the same men arguing days later. One of them, Thomas Ray, the worker the foreman had mentioned, held a folder. "I'm not doing this. I'm going to the board. People could die." The screen crackled and a door slammed. Another man entered. Someone Maya didn't recognize at first. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but his face was clear. Older now, but unmistakable. Harold Mason. Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. Harold was there. He wasn't the innocent whistleblower he'd claimed to be. In the video, he looked panicked. "He knows too much, Mr. Langford. What do you want me to do?" Victor's voice came through again. "Handle it quietly. I don't want names in the papers." The video ended abruptly, the screen cutting to black. Maya sat back, her heart hammering. The anonymous message, he wasn't the only one killed, and now made chilling sense. Thomas Ray's accident had been murder, orchestrated by Langford and carried out by the same man who had later turned state witness. Harold's guilt had eaten at him for years, driving him to leak the truth only when he feared his own life was in danger. The final file opened to a handwritten letter scanned into the drive. It was from Eleanor Langford, Victor's late wife, addressed to whoever finally brings justice. Her words trembled with sorrow. "My husband will never admit what he's done. He's not evil, only blind, blinded by the belief that wealth erases consequence. If you are reading this, it means the truth has found its way home. Let justice be done, but spare his soul if you can. The world doesn't need another death. It needs redemption." Maya's hands trembled as she closed the laptop. Tears burned her eyes, not from anger, but from the unbearable weight of clarity. Justice wasn't a sword. It was a mirror. Moments later, a knock came. The bailiff opened the door. "Your Honor, the jury's ready." Maya composed herself and stepped into the courtroom one last time. Every seat was filled. Reporters leaned forward, jurors solemn, the air thick enough to taste. Victor Langford stood, hands clasped before him, eyes bloodshot but steady. He didn't look defiant anymore, but only tired. The foreman rose. On the count of conspiracy, fraud, and corporate manslaughter, we find the defendant, Victor Langford, guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some people cried. Others simply nodded, as if exhaling after holding their breath for years. Victor closed his eyes. For a brief second, he looked like a man who'd been waiting for punishment, not fearing it but almost welcoming it. When Maya spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of injustice and grace. Mr. Langford, this court does not measure a man by his fortune but by his humanity. You built towers that touched the sky, yet you forgot the foundation beneath them was human lives. Today the law reminds you that no empire stands above truth. She sentenced him not to death or life imprisonment, but something far more humbling. The seizure of all his assets and a lifelong sentence of community restitution, teaching financial literacy and rebuilding housing for the same neighborhoods his greed had once destroyed. It was justice that cut deep, not through vengeance but transformation. As guards led him away, Victor turned back toward her. His lips parted, and for the first time he spoke without arrogance. "Thank you," he whispered. It was not gratitude for mercy, but recognition of something deeper. Liberation from the lie he'd lived. Months later, the city began to heal. Maya visited one of the new community centers funded from Victor's forfeited wealth. Inside, she found him in plain clothes, speaking to a group of young men about integrity. His voice was quieter now, his hands steady. He saw her and paused mid-sentence. Their eyes met, not as judge and criminal, but as two people who had walked through fire and survived. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds. Maya drove to the cemetery where her husband rested. She laid a white lily on the stone and whispered, "It's done." As the breeze rustled through the trees, she realized something profound. Justice was never about punishment. It was about restoration, about turning the ashes of loss into lessons for the living. And as she walked back toward her car, her robe folded over her arm, a reporter called out from across the street, "Judge Carter, do you think the system really works?" She smiled faintly, eyes glimmering with truth. "It works," she said, "when we remember that justice is not about standing over others. It's about standing up for what's right." The cameras flashed. The crowd fell silent, and for the first time in decades, the city felt light again. Because in a world where power once bowed to arrogance, it had finally stood for dignity. And somewhere deep in her heart, Maya Carter knew her husband could finally rest, not in vengeance but in peace.